My name is Grace Ellison, and I'm 52 years old. This happened 3 months ago in a remote place called Huckleberry Hollow, deep in the Shawangunk Ridge of New York. I went there for solitude, to heal after the loss of my husband, Robert, and to pursue my hobby of documenting rare plants. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful retreat. Instead, I stumbled into a nightmare, a haunting that made me question everything I thought I knew about history and myself. Huckleberry Hollow wasn't on any map I could find. I'd read about it in an obscure journal of medicinal botany, describing rare plants that grew in the region's acidic soil. The author had mentioned local legends of a cursed farmhouse, but I dismissed them as the usual folklore you find in remote areas. I had no time for ghost stories. I was a retired professor, a rational woman of science. I thought the woods might help me escape the heaviness I'd been carrying since Robert's death. I parked my RV in a clearing just off an old dirt road. The place was as remote as I'd hoped. No cell signal, no other campers, just the forest stretching out endlessly. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. It felt safe. The first day passed quietly. I hiked through the woods cataloging mosses and wildflowers, filling my notebook with sketches and notes. The forest was dense but beautiful, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden beams. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of peace. That night, I fell asleep to the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves. But the second night, the forest went silent. I woke around midnight to an unnatural stillness. The crickets had stopped, the wind had died, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, just outside the RV. It was too soft to make out, but it sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. The beam illuminated the edge of the clearing, but there was nothing there. Still, the whispering continued, circling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. My heart was pounding as I locked the doors and pulled the curtains shut. I told myself it was the wind, a trick of my tired mind. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I discovered something strange. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I tapped it, shook it, but it was useless. I chalked it up to a magnetic disturbance and decided to stick close to camp. As I walked the perimeter of the clearing, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint trail leading into the woods. It was narrow and overgrown, but curiosity got the better of me. The trail wound through dense thickets, the air growing cooler and darker the deeper I went. After about an hour, I stumbled upon the ruins of an old farmhouse. The structure was barely standing. Its roof caved in, the walls blackened by fire. Around it, the forest seemed darker, the air heavier. I felt a prickle of unease, but pushed it aside. I was here to explore, after all. Near the foundation, I found something half buried in the dirt. An old leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with cramped handwriting. Most of it was illegible, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "The land is cursed. Do not stay." I tucked the journal into my bag and hurried back to the RV. That evening, I tried to focus on cataloging my notes, but the journal nagged at me. I flipped through the pages again, piecing together fragments of the story. It seemed to belong to a woman named Honora Bell, who had lived in the farmhouse centuries ago. The locals had accused her of witchcraft and burned her home to the ground. Her final entries were frantic, filled with pleas for help and warnings about the curse she had left on the land. I didn't believe in curses, but the story unsettled me. I set the journal aside and went to bed, hoping for a better night's sleep. I didn't get one. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the RV. My breath caught as I listened, heart racing. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft scraping sound. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. At first, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I spotted a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied again, the figure was gone. The scraping resumed, louder this time. It was coming from the other side of the RV. I stayed frozen, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline until the sound stopped. For the rest of the night, I didn't dare move. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside to find scratches on the RV's windows, long and jagged. They hadn't been there the day before. My hands shook as I traced the marks, trying to make sense of it. Had it been an animal? A prankster? I didn't know. Desperate for answers, I returned to the farmhouse. The trail seemed longer this time, the air heavier. When I reached the ruins, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind, but I couldn't turn back. As I stood there, something caught my eye. On the charred wall of the farmhouse, words had been scratched into the wood. "Help me." The handwriting matched the journal. That night, Honora came to me. It started with whispers, soft and insistent. Then, I saw her. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, a translucent figure with hollow eyes and charred, tattered clothing. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I froze, unable to look away. She stepped closer, her form flickering like a dying flame. My ears filled with a deafening roar, and suddenly I wasn't in the RV anymore. I was in her farmhouse, watching as the townsfolk dragged her from her home. They screamed accusations, calling her a witch, a murderer. I felt her fear, her anger, as they tied her to a post and set the house ablaze. When the vision ended, I was on the floor of the RV, trembling. Honora's voice echoed in my mind. "Justice. Bring them justice." The next morning, I knew what I had to do. Honora wasn't looking for vengeance. She wanted her story told. Her curse wasn't just a punishment. It was a plea for recognition. I packed my things and left Huckleberry Hollow, the weight of her story heavy on my shoulders. Back home, I began researching Honora's life, piecing together fragments of her story. I wrote an article, blending historical records with my own experiences. It was published in a small history journal, and to my surprise, it gained attention. A group of local historians even launched a campaign to clear Honora's name. I thought that would be the end of it, but some nights, when I'm alone, I still hear whispers. Honora's voice, soft and insistent, reminding me that her story is far from over. My name is Evan Hayes, and I'm 35 years old. This happened 3 summers ago, deep in the Five Ponds Wilderness area in New York. I had been living out of my RV for 6 months by then, traveling alone through the country, searching for peace I wasn't sure I'd ever find. I had left behind a career as a paramedic in the city, a career I loved until the weight of every failure. Every life I couldn't save became too much. I thought solitude in the wild might heal me. Instead, I found something that still haunts me to this day. It was late July when I pulled into a primitive campsite in the heart of Five Ponds. The forest was thick and alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. It felt perfect, untouched, remote, and far from the noise of civilization. No cell service, no people, just me and the wilderness. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my RV at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering pines and dense undergrowth. The sun was setting as I lit my campfire and cooked a simple meal. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of calm, like I'd left the weight of the world behind me. That night, the forest was alive with sound. The chirp of crickets, the distant call of an owl. It was comforting, a lullaby of nature. But in the dead of night, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. It started as a faint cry, like someone far away was calling for help. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. It came again, a low, mournful wail that sent a chill through me. It wasn't human. At least, I didn't think it was. It sounded too deep, too hollow, like it was coming from the trees themselves. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a coyote or an injured deer, and forced myself to go back to sleep. But even as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The next morning, the forest seemed normal again. The sun filtered through the trees, casting warm golden light on the campsite. I shook off the strange feeling from the night before and decided to explore the area. I grabbed my pack, filled it with water and snacks, and set off down an unmarked trail, eager to lose myself in the wilderness. About an hour into my hike, I found something strange. In the muddy bank of a small stream, there were footprints. At first, I thought they were human, barefoot, elongated. But they were too large, the toes ending in sharp claw-like impressions. I crouched down, running my fingers over the damp earth. They didn't make sense. No animal I knew of left tracks like these. They sent a shiver up my spine. When I returned to the campsite, I tried to shake the strange discovery out of my head. I cooked dinner over the fire, then sat outside as the sun set, letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. But as the sky darkened, the familiar chirps and rustles of the woods fell away, replaced by an eerie silence. And then I heard it again, the cry. This time it was louder, closer. It echoed through the trees, long and mournful like a ghostly wail. My chest tightened. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but deep down I knew better. It didn't sound natural, it sounded wrong. I went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't stop listening for the sound, waiting for it to come again. When it did, it was accompanied by something worse. Scratching. Something was dragging claws along the side of my RV, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart pounding, as the sound moved from one side of the vehicle to the other. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window, but the beam cut only into darkness. There was nothing there, just the faint outline of the trees against the moonlit sky. The scratching stopped, leaving only silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I found the tracks again, this time circling the RV. They were identical to the ones I'd seen near the stream, elongated, clawed, and impossibly large. My stomach churned as I stared at them, my mind racing. Something was out here, and it was watching me. I wanted to leave, but the thought of packing up and driving out into the forest, only to find the thing waiting for me, was too much. I decided to stay one more night, thinking maybe it would pass. Maybe it wasn't interested in me. Maybe it would go away. That evening, as I was gathering firewood, I found something even more disturbing. A pile of bones. They were scattered near the edge of the clearing, picked clean and arranged in a deliberate pattern, a circle with a triangle in the center. Among them was a human skull, cracked and weathered. My breath hitched and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the wood. I hurried back to the RV, locking myself inside as soon as the sun set. I didn't bother with the fire. I sat in the dark, clutching a knife, waiting. That night, the crying started again, louder and more insistent. It didn't come from one direction. It seemed to echo all around me, as if the forest itself was wailing. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, Just beyond the reach of the RV's headlights stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like two burning embers. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze locked on me, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my body frozen in place. The thing took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but the beam barely seemed to touch it. It let out a low, guttural growl, then disappeared into the trees. The next few hours were a blur of terror. The thing circled the RV, its cries growing louder, more frantic. At one point, it began to mimic voices. My voice. I heard myself calling from the forest, pleading for help, begging to be let in. The sound was so convincing I almost believed it, but deep down, I knew it was a trap. Desperate, I remembered something I'd read about wendigos in an old folklore book. They were spirits of hunger, driven to devour anything in their path. Fire, the book had said, could drive them away. I gathered the last of my firewood and built a bonfire outside the RV, praying it would keep the creature at bay. As the flames roared to life, the cries stopped. The forest fell silent, and for a moment I thought I'd won. But then I saw it again, standing at the edge of the light. The wendigo's gaunt frame was illuminated by the fire, its hollow eyes staring into mine. It didn't attack. Instead, it whispered, "You cannot run. You cannot hide." By dawn, the thing was gone. The fire had burned out, leaving only smoldering ashes. Exhausted and terrified, I packed up the RV and drove out of the forest as fast as I could. The road seemed endless, the trees pressing in on all sides. But eventually, I found my way back to civilization. I never returned to Five Ponds. I never even camped again. The wilderness I had once loved became a place of nightmares, a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it, the faint, mournful cry of the wendigo calling from the shadows. My name is Ashley Cooper, and I'm 26 years old. This happened 2 years ago, in late October, at a place called Devil's Tombstone Campground in the Catskill Mountains of New York. I had heard the name before, tied to spooky legends about witches and ghosts, but to me, it sounded like the perfect place for a weekend of camping with my friends. I wish I could tell you we left with fun stories and great memories. Instead, we barely got out alive. It all started with a simple idea: to prove that ghost stories were just that, stories. I'd always loved the outdoors and considered myself something of an adventurer. My best friend Eric was less enthusiastic. At 25, he'd rather be glued to his gaming console than trekking through the woods, but he'd do anything for me. Danny, my 24-year-old roommate and cousin, was different. She loved photography and couldn't resist the idea of capturing the eerie beauty of the Catskills. Maya, Danny's older sister, tagged along reluctantly, more interested in her spreadsheets and to-do lists than anything supernatural. The four of us piled into the RV on Friday afternoon, stocked with supplies, firewood, and enough snacks to last a week. The drive-up was uneventful. We laughed, argued about music, and joked about running into ghosts. By the time we reached Devil's Tombstone, the sun was setting, painting the forest in fiery hues. The place was eerily quiet, with no other campers in sight. "It's just us," Eric said, smirking. "Looks like we're the only ones brave enough to face the devil." "Or stupid enough," Maya muttered. We parked the RV at a secluded spot near the edge of the woods and started setting up camp. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that settled over us like a blanket. "Is it always this quiet in the woods?" Danny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just the time of year," I said, though even I wasn't convinced. The first strange thing happened that night. We were sitting around the campfire roasting marshmallows when Danny froze. "Do you hear that?" she asked, tilting her head toward the woods. "Hear what?" I said. "It sounds like chanting," she said. We all stopped talking and listened. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I heard it too. Faint and distant, like whispers carried on the wind. "Probably just the wind," Eric said, shoving a marshmallow into his mouth. "No way," Danny insisted. It's a voice. Listen." I strained to hear, but by then the sound had stopped. Maya rolled her eyes and went back to organizing her flashlight and map. Eric joked about witches coming to steal our snacks. I laughed along with him, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. The next morning, Danny woke me early, her face pale. "Ashley, come look at this," she said. I stumbled out of the RV and followed her to the side of the vehicle. Deep scratches ran across the metal, long and jagged, as if something with claws had raked against it during the night. "Probably a bear," I said, trying to stay calm. "Bears don't make marks like this," Danny whispered, tracing the grooves with her fingers. "Look at the height. Whatever did this had to be standing on 2 legs." I didn't have an answer for her, and neither did the others when they joined us. Maya scoffed and suggested it was just vandalism, though her voice wavered. Eric joked about getting haunted RV insurance, but even he seemed shaken. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, trying to shake off the morning's discovery. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with its golden leaves and crisp air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Danny kept stopping to take photos, though she seemed distracted, glancing over her shoulder every few minutes. That night, things got worse. We were sitting in the RV, playing cards by lantern light, when we heard it. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. It started on one side of the RV, then moved around to the other, slow and deliberate. We froze, listening as the sound circled us. "Bear," Eric stammered, gripping his cards tightly. "Not a bear," Maya said, her voice barely audible. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out the window. Nothing. The scraping stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. "I'm telling you, it's someone messing with us," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. Maya nodded. Probably some stupid prank. But Danny's face told a different story. She looked terrified, clutching her camera like a lifeline. The final straw came the next morning. We stepped out of the RV to find strange symbols drawn in ash all around our campsite. They were crude and uneven, like they'd been made by a trembling hand. None of us recognized them, but Danny swore they looked like something out of an occult book she'd read. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Relax," I said, though my heart was racing. "It's probably just some kids trying to scare us." "Who? There's no one else here," Danny snapped. Maya sighed. "I'll look up the symbols. Maybe it's just some weird local thing." She pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. No way to call for help or research the symbols. That's when Eric's expression changed. "What the hell?" he muttered, pointing to his bag. His belongings, clothes, toiletries, snacks, had been pulled out and arranged in a circle on the ground. None of us had touched them. By nightfall, the tension was unbearable. Danny wouldn't stop pacing. Maya was snapping at everyone, and Eric sat in a corner glaring at the floor. I tried to keep us calm, but my own nerves were fraying. That's when I heard it, my voice, calling from the woods. Ashley, help me! I froze, staring out into the darkness. The voice came again, identical to mine, but tinged with desperation. Ashley, please. It's a trick, Danny whispered, grabbing my arm. Don't go out there. How do you know? I whispered back, my heart pounding. I don't know, but it's not you, she said. I stayed put, but the voice didn't stop. It called and called, each cry more frantic than the last, until finally it faded into silence. That night, none of us slept. We stayed huddled in the RV, jumping at every sound. Around midnight, the air grew heavy, and a foul smell filled the space. That's when we saw her. She appeared outside the window, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes and stringy black hair, her mouth twisted into a snarl, and her bony hand raked against the glass. Danny screamed, and the figure vanished, only to reappear moments later at another window. It's her, Danny whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's Eleanor Gray. Who? I asked, my voice trembling. The witch. She cursed this place. She said she'd never let anyone leave. We tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The forest road seemed to loop endlessly, always leading back to the campsite. Eleanor's figure appeared again and again, watching us, whispering things we couldn't understand. We have to do something, Danny said, her voice shaking. We have to make an offering. An offering? Maya snapped. You've got to be kidding me. She wants something from us, Danny insisted. She won't let us go unless we give it to her. After a heated argument, we agreed. We each took something important to us and placed it in the fire pit. My journal, Danny's camera, Eric's gaming console, and Maya's planner. We lit the pile on fire and waited. As the flames consumed our belongings, Eleanor appeared one last time. She stood at the edge of the firelight, her hollow eyes fixed on us. Then, without a sound, she vanished. The RV started on the first try. We drove away in silence, the forest finally releasing us. But even as we left Devil's Tombstone behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Weeks later, Danny developed her photos from the trip. One of them stopped my heart. It showed the four of us standing by the RV, smiling. But behind us, in the shadows, stood a blurred, ghostly figure. Eleanor Gray was still with us. My name is Ethan Cross, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in October 2023 when I took my RV into a place called Hunter's Valley, near the Catskill Mountains in New York. I've always been drawn to solitude. Growing up, I preferred the quiet of the woods to the chaos of people. After everything that happened, my failed engagement, losing my job, getting out into the wilderness felt like the only thing that could clear my head. It was supposed to be a week-long trip to reset, test some new off-grid equipment, and maybe hunt a bit. I never planned for it to go the way it did. Hunter's Valley wasn't on any major map. I found it through a forum for survivalists. They called it a forgotten paradise, with dense forests, clean rivers, and trails that seemed untouched by human feet. It sounded perfect. My RV, an old but sturdy model I'd spent months outfitting with solar panels and water filtration systems, was ready for the challenge. When I arrived, the place lived up to its reputation. Mist clung to the valley like a ghostly veil, and the trees stretched so high they blocked out most of the sky. It was quiet. Too quiet, I noticed. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. Still, I told myself it was part of the charm. I parked the RV on a flat patch of dirt near the trailhead and set up camp. The first day passed uneventfully. I walked a few trails, tested my new gear, and even managed to catch a rabbit. The silence was unsettling, but I brushed it off as my city nerves adjusting to nature. That night, as I sat by the fire, the mist thickened. The forest became a wall of gray, and the only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the occasional creak of the RV settling. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling, "Help! Someone, please!" I froze, my ears straining. It came again, closer this time. "Help me!" Grabbing my flashlight, I stood and scanned the forest. The beam of light cut through the mist, but there was nothing. No movement, no person. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed, but there was no response. The rational part of me said it was probably just the wind playing tricks, so I went back to the fire, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next morning, I found footprints near the RV. Massive, human-like prints that couldn't have been mine. They were barefoot, the toes long and clawed, and they ended abruptly about 20 feet from the RV, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I wanted to leave right then, but I convinced myself to stay. I'd driven hours to get here, and I wasn't about to let some weird tracks scare me off. Instead, I spent the day exploring deeper into the valley. That's when I noticed the wildlife, or lack of it. There were no squirrels, no deer, no birds. Even the underbrush looked untouched, as if nothing lived there. As I walked, I found a carcass, a raccoon, or what was left of it. The body was splayed open, its organs missing, and the cuts were clean, almost surgical. I crouched down to examine it and felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, like I was being watched. When I turned, the forest was empty. Still, I hiked back to camp, my heart pounding the whole way. That night, the whispers started. I was inside the RV, eating a can of beans, when I heard them. Low, almost inaudible, like someone murmuring just outside. I turned off the lights and peered out the window, but the mist was too thick to see anything. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like my name, Ethan. I grabbed my hunting rifle and stepped outside, the cold air biting my skin. The forest was still, the mist pressing in on all sides. "Who's out there?" I called, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a laugh. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, and it sent a chill down my spine. I bolted back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I stayed up all night, clutching the rifle, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I told myself I was being paranoid. Stress, maybe. Isolation playing tricks on my mind. The third day is when I began to lose time. I woke up at noon, though I didn't remember falling asleep. My watch had stopped, and the RV's clock was blank. Outside, the fire pit was cold, but I didn't recall extinguishing it. My knife, which I always kept on the counter, was missing. I spent the day trying to shake off the fog in my head, but everything felt off. The silence was oppressive, the air too still. I decided to hike to a nearby stream for water, thinking a change of scenery might help. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, partially obscured by trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly arms. Its face was wrong, too pale, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the mist. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, it just stared. I froze, my pulse hammering. When I finally mustered the courage to call out, "Hey, who are you?" The thing tilted its head as if studying me. Then it turned and vanished into the trees, moving so fast it was a blur. I ran back to camp, abandoning the water. I needed to leave, but when I started the RV, the engine sputtered and died. The solar panels weren't charging and the battery was completely drained. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. That night, it came closer. I was sitting in the dark, the rifle in my lap, when I heard footsteps circling the RV. Slow, deliberate. Every hair on my body stood on end. The footsteps stopped by the door, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard my own voice calling from the forest. "Ethan, come out." I gripped the rifle tighter, my breathing ragged. "What do you want?" I shouted. The thing outside didn't answer, but I heard it laugh again. That same childlike giggle. The windows began to rattle, and the RV shook as if something massive was pushing against it. I fired a shot through the door, and the noise stopped. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the mist, silent and unmoving. The next morning, I found symbols carved into the ground around the RV. Circles, triangles, and lines I didn't recognize. My knife was embedded in one of the carvings, its blade coated in something dark and sticky. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was someone messing with me, or was it something else? That afternoon, I decided to make a break for it on foot. I packed what I could and started down the trail. But no matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the RV. It was as if the forest itself was keeping me there. By the 5th day, I was unraveling. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. I kept hearing Brian, my childhood best friend who died on a camping trip when we were kids. "It's your fault," he whispered in my ear. "You let me drown." His voice was so clear, so real, that I started to believe it wasn't just in my head. That night, the creature came again. This time, it didn't hide. It stood just outside the firelight, its gaunt body swaying like a broken marionette. "Ethan," it said, in a voice that wasn't quite human. "You're mine now." It lunged, and I fired, the shot echoing through the valley. The creature shrieked, a sound so piercing I thought my ears would bleed, but it didn't fall. It kept coming, its glowing eyes locked on me. I remembered something I'd read once about spirits and fire. Desperate, I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and doused the ground around the RV, striking a match and setting it ablaze. The flames roared to life, creating a barrier between me and the creature. It screamed again, retreating into the mist. When dawn broke, I stumbled out of the valley, my body weak, my mind shattered. I found a dirt road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver said he'd never heard of Hunter's Valley. When I tried to explain what had happened, he just looked at me like I was crazy. I made it back to civilization, but I haven't been the same since. Sometimes at night, I hear the whispers again. And last week, I found a new symbol carved into my bedroom wall. The hunger hasn't forgotten me. I don't think it ever will. My name is Mark Everett, and I'm 45 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023 during what I thought would be a peaceful RV trip with my daughter, Emily. I planned the getaway because, after my divorce earlier that year, things had been rocky between us. Emily's 14, and like most teenagers, she's glued to her phone, lost in a world I barely understand. I thought some time away in Black Creek Forest, a quiet, lesser-known spot near Albany, would give us a chance to reconnect. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started with the RV. The damn thing was older than I'd like to admit, and I hadn't used it since before Emily was born. The battery acted up from the start, dying twice before we even made it out of the driveway, but I brushed it off. "We'll be fine," I told myself. A few nights unplugged from the world would do us good. When we arrived at Black Creek, the forest was beautiful, in a haunting kind of way. Tall, dark trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves golden under the October sun. Emily hated it immediately. "This is the middle of nowhere," she groaned, slumping into her seat. "Why couldn't we just go to Lake George or somewhere normal?" "Because we don't need a crowd," I said. "This is about us spending time together." Emily didn't answer. She just looked out the window, earbuds in, arms crossed. Shadow, our German shepherd, paced excitedly around the RV, thrilled to be anywhere but the house. We set up camp near the edge of the forest, close to a narrow, overgrown trail. The first night was uneventful, except for the RV battery dying again. I spent 2 hours fumbling with the jumper cables in the dark while Emily scrolled through her phone, grumbling about the lack of Wi-Fi. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. Emily refused at first, but Shadow wouldn't stop barking until she grabbed her jacket. The three of us followed the trail into the forest, where the air felt different, heavier somehow. About an hour in, Emily found the first totem. "Dad, look!" she called, her voice uncertain. I turned to see her pointing at a crude wooden figure hanging from a tree. It was small, no more than 6 inches tall, made of twigs bound together with string. Feathers and tufts of animal fur dangled from its arms. Shadow growled, his ears flat against his head. "Probably just some kid's art project," I said, trying to sound casual. Emily shook her head. "This is old," she murmured, tracing the string with her finger. "Like, really old." I didn't have a good response to that. Something about the totem unsettled me, but I wasn't about to show it. "Come on," I said, "let's keep moving." We found more of them as we walked, dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered through the trees. They hung from low branches, hidden in bushes, even nailed to the trunks themselves. The deeper we went, the more intricate they became. Some had carved faces, others were wrapped in what looked like animal sinew. Emily took pictures of a few, muttering about how creepy they were. Shadow refused to go any further after the third one. He sat on the trail, barking at nothing, his hackles raised. I figured it was time to head back. That night, things got worse. It started with the whispers. I was outside the RV, adding firewood to the small pit I'd built, when I heard them. Faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind brushing through the leaves. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, clearer. "Emily," I called, poking my head inside. "Turn off your phone." "It's off," she said, annoyed. She was lying on the couch, Shadow curled up at her feet. "There's no signal out here, remember?" I frowned and stepped back outside. The whispers were still there, low and urgent, just beyond the firelight. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded like my name. By midnight, the RV felt stifling. The battery had died again, so we had no power or heat. Emily was asleep, but Shadow wouldn't settle. He paced the small space, whining softly, his eyes fixed on the windows. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of scratching. It came from outside, soft but deliberate, like nails raking against metal. Shadow went wild, barking and lunging at the door. I grabbed a flashlight and opened it cautiously, heart pounding. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Shadow kept barking, his gaze locked on something I couldn't see. After a few minutes, he stopped, but the tension in the air didn't lift. The next morning, I found claw marks on the side of the RV. They were deep and jagged, running the length of the vehicle. Emily noticed them too. "What did that?" she asked, wide-eyed. "Bear," I lied, "nothing to worry about." She didn't buy it, neither did I. As we ate breakfast, Shadow started barking again. This time, he bolted into the forest before I could stop him. Emily screamed, and we both ran after him, the trees closing in around us. "Shadow!" I shouted, but the dog was gone. We followed his barks deeper and deeper until we stumbled into a clearing. In the center was a large tree with strange symbols carved into its trunk. Circles, triangles, and jagged lines that looked almost like writing. Dad, Emily whispered, this is witchcraft. I didn't respond. The air in the clearing was icy cold and the whispers were back, louder than ever. Shadow's barking came from somewhere beyond the tree, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Neither could Emily. We stood there for what felt like hours, until Shadow reappeared. His fur matted and his eyes wild. He whimpered and pressed himself against my leg, refusing to look at the tree. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing Emily's arm. "Now." Back at the RV, the situation unraveled quickly. The power was still out, and Emily wouldn't stop shaking. She kept muttering about the tree, saying she could still hear the whispers. That night, the witch came. It started with the windows. They rattled violently as though something, or someone, was trying to get in. Shadow barked, but this time it wasn't his usual bark. It was high-pitched, panicked, like he was terrified. Emily clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. Then we saw her. She appeared in the firelight outside the RV, tall and thin, with a tattered dress and hollow eyes that seemed to glow. Her mouth didn't move, but the whispers grew deafening, filling every corner of my mind. Emily screamed, and Shadow lunged at the door, snarling. The witch raised one hand and the RV began to shake. Objects flew off shelves. The walls groaned, and the temperature plummeted. I grabbed Emily and pulled her close, whispering, "It's okay, I've got you." But it wasn't okay, not even close. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I did. Something in the back of my mind told me what to do. A memory, maybe, or instinct. I grabbed my hunting knife and carved one of the symbols from the tree into the RV's door. The shaking stopped immediately. The witch let out an ear-piercing scream and vanished, leaving behind a silence that was almost worse than the noise. We didn't sleep that night. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and left. The RV barely started, and the drive home was a blur. Emily didn't say a word, and Shadow wouldn't stop trembling. When we finally made it back to civilization, I thought we were safe. But last week, Emily showed me something on her phone. Pictures she'd taken of the totems. In the background of one, I saw her. The witch, and she was smiling. My name is Rebecca Hale, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in October 2023 when I traveled to Devil's Hollow in upstate New York. I'm a travel blogger, specializing in solo trips to remote locations, and I thought this trip would be my ticket to fame. The plan was simple. Spend 3 nights at an abandoned campground, document everything, and write about its ghost stories. But things didn't go as planned. By the time I left, I was lucky to be alive. Devil's Hollow wasn't on any modern maps. I found it through an old article in a local archive. In the 1980s, the campground was shut down after a string of mysterious disappearances, including an entire family whose RV was found abandoned. Rumors of hauntings swirled, and the place fell into legend. Perfect fodder for my blog, or so I thought. The journey there was rough. My GPS failed about an hour before I arrived, forcing me to rely on a map I'd printed out. The dirt road leading to the campground was barely passable, overgrown with weeds and potholes big enough to swallow a tire. My RV, a small, trusty vehicle I'd taken on dozens of trips, groaned in protest as I navigated the treacherous path. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the crumbling remains of the campground. The place was a graveyard. The roads were cracked and covered in moss. The playground equipment rusted and twisted, and the old cabins looked like they'd been abandoned midsummer. My RV was the only sign of life in the entire hollow, and the silence was deafening. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. I parked near the overgrown remains of the main office and set up camp. The first night, nothing happened, at least nothing I could explain. I heard faint sounds outside the RV, like footsteps crunching on gravel. But when I shone my flashlight out the window, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to animals and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I grabbed my camera and started exploring. The playground was my first stop. It was eerie. Swings swayed gently in the breeze, even though the air was completely still. I snapped a few photos and moved on to the cabins. They were in worse shape than I expected, the wood rotting and the doors hanging off their hinges. Inside one, I found bunk beds covered in decades-old graffiti. The names of campers were scratched into the walls along with messages like "Stay away" and "Don't trust him." It wasn't until I reviewed my photos later that I noticed something strange. In one shot of the playground, there was a faint blur of light near the swings, almost like a face, but distorted. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. That night, the real trouble began. I was sitting in the RV, editing photos, when I heard it. Children's laughter, faint and distant. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the kind of sound you expect in an abandoned campground, and it wasn't coming from my laptop. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the mist that had rolled in. The laughter stopped as soon as I opened the door. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. I walked a few steps toward the playground, shining my light around, but the only thing I saw was my own breath in the cold air. I was about to head back when I spotted something on the window of the RV. Small handprints smeared across the glass. They weren't there before. I didn't sleep much that night. By the second morning, I was exhausted, but determined to stay. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was scaring myself because I wanted the story to be real. But when I stepped outside to make coffee, I noticed the clock on my RV dashboard had stopped at 3:17 a.m., the same time I'd woken up, freezing and disoriented. I decided to explore further, heading toward the far edge of the campground where the trees grew denser. There, I found a cabin unlike the others. It was larger, with broken windows and a porch that sagged under its own weight. Carved into the door were the words, "Holloway's Cabin." I remembered the name from my research. Mr. Holloway was a camp counselor in the 1970s, rumored to be responsible for several accidents that had claimed the lives of young campers. According to legend, he disappeared one night and his body was never found. Locals whispered that he still haunted the hollow, watching over the campground he'd once ruled. Inside, the air was thick and musty, and the floor creaked under my boots. The walls were covered in strange symbols, circles, triangles, and jagged lines I didn't recognize. In one corner, I found an old photograph in a broken frame. It showed a group of children standing in front of the playground, smiling awkwardly at the camera. Behind them stood a tall man with a stern face and hollow eyes. The caption read, "Camp Devil's Hollow, Summer, 1975. That night, the spirits revealed themselves. It started with the voices, soft, almost imperceptible whispers outside the RV. Then came the banging, loud and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, my heart pounding. The windows fogged up and I saw words appearing in the condensation. "Stay!" Panic set in. I swung open the door, shouting, "Leave me alone!" The forest was silent, the mist so thick I could barely see the edge of the firelight. Then I saw him. A tall figure stood just beyond the light, his outline barely visible through the fog. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. He raised one hand and pointed at me, his voice low and raspy. Rebecca. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door. The banging resumed, louder than before, and the entire vehicle shook as if it were being lifted off the ground. I fired a shot through the door, the sound deafening in the small space. The shaking stopped. When I finally opened the door, the figure was gone. But the ground around the RV was covered in those strange symbols, carved deep into the dirt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. By the third day, I was unraveling. I hadn't eaten or slept, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. I wanted to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. My phone had no signal, and I realized I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was. I was completely alone. That afternoon I tried hiking out, but no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the RV. It was as if the hollow itself was keeping me there. That night, the spirits attacked. I was lying on the floor of the RV, clutching my rifle, when the banging started again. This time, it was everywhere. On the roof, the windows, the door. The lights flickered and the air grew so cold I could see my breath. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Then, the door burst open. A wave of freezing air swept in, and I saw them. Shadowy figures pouring into the RV, their forms barely human. Leading them was Mr. Holloway, his hollow eyes burning with malice. He reached for me, his voice like gravel. "Stay with us." I don't know where I found the strength, but I remembered the oak tree in the center of the campground. Legends said it was the heart of the hollow, the place where the spirit's power was strongest. If I could destroy it, maybe I could break their hold. Grabbing my emergency propane torch, I ran into the night. The figures followed, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. When I reached the tree, I didn't hesitate. I doused the trunk in propane and lit it. The fire roared to life, and the spirits screamed, a sound so piercing I thought my ears would burst. The figures dissolved into smoke, and the fog lifted, revealing the night sky for the first time. I escaped just before dawn, the RV sputtering to life as I drove out of the hollow. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed in a diner parking lot. The locals didn't believe my story, but that didn't matter. I'd survived, or so I thought. A week later, back home, I noticed something strange in one of my photos from the playground. A tall figure stood in the background, his hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. That night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of children laughing outside my window. When I looked outside, I saw handprints smeared across the glass. The hollow hasn't let me go, and I don't think it ever will. My name is Clara Hayes, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last fall when I was traveling solo in my RV, parked at a remote spot near Black River Bay in upstate New York. At the time, I had just started a travel blog. Nothing fancy, just a place to document my adventures and photos. After leaving my high-stress journalism job, I wanted to reconnect with nature, find stories in the land, and maybe rediscover myself in the process. Black River Bay seemed perfect. Marshes, tangled inlets, and the quiet solitude of Lake Ontario, a photographer's dream. But what I found there was something I still struggled to explain. I rolled into the RV park late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the trees. It wasn't much, just a gravel lot with a few hookups surrounded by dense woods. The bay shimmered in the distance, golden and still. As I set up camp, an older man approached. He looked to be in his 60s, his face deeply lined, his clothes faded and practical. "You here alone?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Yeah," I said. "Just me and my camera." He nodded slowly. "Name's Roy. I look after this place." We chatted for a bit, and he seemed nice enough, though there was something off about him, an edge of nervousness. "You be careful out there," he said as he turned to leave. "Don't go wandering after dark, especially near the water. And if you see a light out there, don't follow it." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me. What, like a will-o'-the-wisp? He didn't smile. "We call him the Lantern Man. Don't make him mad." That night, I couldn't get Roy's warning out of my head. The Lantern Man. It was probably just a local legend, meant to keep curious tourists like me from getting lost in the marsh. Still, as I cooked dinner in the RV and listened to the wind whisper through the trees, the thought of some phantom ferryman made the shadows feel a little darker. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint splashing sound, like something moving in the water. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The air was damp and cold, the kind that seeps into your bones. I scanned the clearing, but everything was still, too still. The wind had stopped, and the crickets had gone silent. And then I saw it. A faint, flickering light hovering just above the marsh. It swayed gently, like a lantern swinging in the breeze. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The light didn't answer, but it began to move, gliding away from the clearing. Against my better judgment, I followed it, my boots sinking into the soft ground. As I got closer, the light seemed to grow brighter, sharper, almost hypnotic. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I thought I heard whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. Suddenly, the light vanished, plunging me into darkness. I turned in a circle, my flashlight cutting through the fog. I couldn't see the RV anymore, couldn't even hear the bay. Panic rose in my throat, and I stumbled back the way I thought I'd come. The shadows seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an almost electric tension. When I finally found the RV, I locked the door and didn't come out again until morning. The next morning, I found Roy waiting by the water. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his eyes sharp. "It was just a light," I said, though even I didn't believe it. Roy shook his head. "That's how it starts. He'll try to lure you in, get you lost in the marsh, and if he gets you—" He trailed off, his face grim. I wanted to brush him off, but there was a weight to his words that made my stomach twist. Still, I told myself it was just a story. Determined to shake the unease, I spent the day exploring the bay. The water sparkled in the sun, and I snapped photos of reeds and distant herons. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew heavy again. The marsh seemed darker, the air cooler, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. That evening, while wandering near an old dock, I found a crumbling cabin half hidden in the reeds. The roof had caved in and the windows were shattered, but inside I found a dusty old journal. The entries were faded, written by someone named Samuel. He described hearing strange lights and whispers at night, seeing a lantern bobbing in the distance. The last few entries were frantic, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I saw him tonight. He stood at the water's edge watching me. I could feel his hate. The light is closer now. It's in my dreams, calling me to the bay. He wants me to follow. I don't think I can resist much longer." The final entry simply read, "Don't follow the light." That night, the light returned. This time, it came closer, flickering just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stayed inside the RV, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. But then I heard it, a soft knock on the door. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time. "Clara," a voice called, low and raspy. "Let me in." It sounded like Roy, but something was wrong. His voice was too flat, too hollow, like a bad recording. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, through the window, I saw it, the light, brighter than before, hovering just outside. I couldn't look away. It filled my vision, burning like a flame, pulling me toward the door. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the handle. At the last second, I snapped out of it and stumbled back, breaking the light's hold. The lantern flickered angrily before retreating into the marsh. By dawn, I'd had enough. I packed up my things and prepared to leave, but as I started the RV, the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," I muttered, turning the key again. Nothing. Steeling myself, I grabbed my gear and headed toward the main road, hoping to find help. But as I walked, the fog thickened, and the light appeared again, bobbing in the distance. "Not this time," I whispered, turning away. But the light didn't retreat. It grew brighter, closer, until it was right in front of me. Behind it, a figure emerged, a tall, shadowy man holding a lantern. His face was obscured, but his presence was suffocating. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice like gravel. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What do you want?" "To make them pay," he said, his lantern flaring. The marsh began to shift beneath me, the ground turning soft and unstable. I sank to my knees, the cold water soaking through my jeans. The lantern man stepped closer, his light blinding. "Please," I gasped. "I didn't do anything." For a moment he hesitated, and in that moment I heard another voice. Roy's, faint but clear. "Clara, this way!" I turned to see him standing on solid ground, waving me toward him. Summoning every ounce of strength, I clawed my way out of the muck and stumbled into his arms. When I looked back, the lantern man was gone. Back at the RV, I thanked Roy for saving me. But as I reviewed my photos later, a chill ran down my spine. In one of the shots, taken just before I escaped, I saw Roy standing by the water, holding a lantern. His face was blank, featureless, like a shadow wearing human skin. I left Black River Bay the next morning and never looked back. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see the light, flickering in the distance, waiting for me to follow. My name is Evan Turner, and I'm 33 years old. This happened in late October last year when I took my RV to a remote spot near Alder Creek in the Adirondack Mountains. I'm a photographer. Well, an aspiring one. I've been traveling solo ever since my girlfriend and I broke up 6 months ago. She said I was too distant, too absorbed in my work. She wasn't wrong. I thought getting away to the wilderness, far from the noise of my thoughts, would help me reset. But Alder Creek turned out to be more than I bargained for. The road to Alder Creek was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My GPS stopped working about a mile before I reached the clearing I'd chosen to camp. It didn't bother me much. I had a printed map and a knack for finding my way. When I finally parked the RV and stepped out, the first thing I noticed was the smell. The air was damp and earthy, tinged with the decay, like wet leaves left to rot. Alder Creek snaked along the edge of the clearing. Its dark water sluggish and choked with reeds. The trees leaned in close, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. I set up my gear quickly, eager to start shooting. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water, and the light was perfect. I forgot about everything else, my breakup, the uneasy stillness, even the chill creeping into my bones. As I lined up my first shot, an old woman's voice startled me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to see a wiry, hunched figure standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked ancient, her face lined and weathered like the bark of the trees. She wore a long coat and carried a walking stick, its end gnarled like a claw. "Excuse me?" I asked, lowering my camera. "This place isn't for you," she said, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "Alder Creek doesn't like visitors." I forced a smile, assuming she was just another local with a flair for drama. "I'll be careful," I said. "Just here for the photos." She shook her head, her expression dark. "It's not about being careful. It's about respect. Silent Star doesn't take kindly to trespassers." Silent Star? She was the shaman of the people who lived here before the settlers came. When they betrayed her, she cursed this land. Now she watches the creek, waiting for the unworthy. I felt a prickle of unease, but didn't let it show. "Thanks for the warning," I said. "I'll keep that in mind." The woman stared at me a moment longer, then turned and shuffled back into the woods, muttering something I couldn't hear. Her words lingered with me, though, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows seemed to stretch farther, darker. That night, the first signs came. I was reviewing the day's shots inside the RV, pleased with the golden light I'd captured when I heard it. A low, rhythmic drumming. I froze, listening. It didn't sound like anything natural, too deliberate, too even. It echoed faintly through the trees, growing louder, then fading again. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The fire I'd built earlier was nothing but glowing embers now, casting a faint red glow across the clearing. The drumming had stopped, replaced by the rush of the creek. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. Shaking my head, I muttered, "Just the wind," and went back inside. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I headed to the creek to get some early shots. The light was softer than the day before, diffused through a heavy layer of clouds. As I waded along the muddy bank, my camera suddenly stopped working. The screen flickered, then went black. "Come on," I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. When it finally powered back on, I checked the photos I'd just taken. My heart skipped a beat. In every frame, faint, shadowy figures stood along the creek's edge, their shapes hazy and indistinct. They hadn't been there when I was shooting. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. Still, I couldn't bring myself to delete the photos. Later that day, I drove to a nearby ranger station to report the strange occurrences. The station looked abandoned, its windows boarded up. Inside, the shelves were bare, except for a dusty old journal left on the desk. Curious, I opened it. The entries were from another camper, dated 2 years ago. The writer described hearing drumming at night, seeing strange figures and feeling like they were being watched. The final entry read, "She knows when you're alone. Don't go near the creek at night." I slammed the journal shut, unnerved, and decided to head back to camp. On the way, I ran into the old woman again, Marjorie. "You didn't listen, did you?" she said, shaking her head. "I don't believe in curses," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "Then you'll believe in fear," she replied. "When she comes for you tonight, you'll wish you had left." I couldn't sleep that night. The RV felt too small, the darkness outside pressing in like a living thing. Around midnight, I heard it again. The drumming. Louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold. The clearing was thick with fog, the air damp and heavy. The drumming stopped as soon as I stepped outside, replaced by an eerie silence. Then I saw them. Muddy footprints, leading from the creek to my RV. They were fresh, each step perfectly outlined in the soft earth. My pulse quickened as I followed them to the water's edge. The creek glistened under the faint moonlight, its surface unnaturally still, And then, rising slowly from the water, she appeared. Silent Star. She was tall, her long hair clinging to her face like wet vines. Her eyes burned with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard her voice in my head, sharp and angry. "You disturb my land. You take from it without offering." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was closing. "You must pay," she said, her voice echoing in my skull. Suddenly, I was back at the clearing, though I didn't remember walking there. My camera lay at my feet, its lens cracked. Silent Star stood before me, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You took from my land," she said again. "Now you must give back." I didn't know what she wanted. My mind raced as I remembered Marjorie's words. "Show respect." Trembling, I picked up my camera. It was my lifeline, my passion, the one thing I'd clung to through every setback. But if this was what she wanted, I'd give it. With a shaking hand, I walked to the creek and threw the camera into the water. It sank quickly, disappearing into the black depths. Silent Star's burning eyes softened, and her form began to fade. The last thing I heard was her whisper, "Go." The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the clearing in light. The air felt lighter, the oppressive stillness gone. I packed up and left Alder Creek, my chest tight with a mix of relief and sorrow. Weeks later, when I developed the few photos I had left, I found one that sent chills down my spine. Silent Star, standing in the creek, her eyes fixed on the camera. I haven't been back to Alder Creek since, and I don't think I ever will. My name is Nate Carter, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in October of last year, when I agreed to take a hiking trip with my closest friends to Devil's Path in the Catskill Mountains. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Heather, my best friend since high school, was the one who planned it, and she had this ridiculous obsession with ghost stories. She thought going to one of the most haunted trails in New York would be a great way to boost her YouTube channel. It wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but I went along because she'd roped in Sam, her boyfriend, and Emily, a mutual friend of ours. I figured I'd keep an eye on everyone and make sure we didn't end up on some missing hiker news report. We parked the RV at a small lot near the trailhead late Friday afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, with that faint, earthy smell of autumn leaves. Heather, 27, was bouncing with excitement, her camera in hand, already filming everything. Sam, also 27, was quiet but smiling at her antics, as he always did. And Emily, 26, was uncharacteristically tense, pulling her jacket tight around her. I didn't think much of it then, but later, I'd remember the way she glanced at the woods, like she was already seeing something the rest of us couldn't. The hike started out fine, at least as fine as it could be on a trail named Devil's Path. The terrain was brutal. Steep inclines, jagged rocks, and paths so narrow you had to press yourself against the cliffside to let someone pass. By the time we stopped to set up camp, my legs were burning. We found a small clearing just off the trail, far enough from the main path to avoid any late-night wanderers. As we pitched the tents, Heather kept talking about the legends surrounding the trail. "They say there's this thing called the Whisperer," she said, grinning as she set up her tripod. "It mimics voices to lure people into the woods. Pretty creepy, right?" "Not as creepy as your obsession with this stuff," I muttered, earning a laugh from Sam. "You're just scared," Heather shot back, winking. I ignored her and focused on building a fire. Emily stayed quiet, but I noticed she kept glancing toward the trees. When I asked her if she was okay, she just nodded and mumbled something about being tired. That night, as we sat around the fire, Emily suddenly stiffened. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all went silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone muttering just out of earshot. "It's probably the wind," I said, trying to sound confident, though a chill ran down my spine. Heather, of course, looked thrilled. "Or it's the whisperer," she said dramatically, shining her flashlight into the trees. Nothing was there. But Emily didn't relax. She didn't say much for the rest of the night, and when we finally crawled into our tents, I could hear her shifting restlessly on her sleeping pad. The next morning, we discovered something strange. My boots, which I'd left outside my tent, were lined up in a neat row several feet away, pointing toward the woods. "Heather, very funny," I said, holding them up. "It wasn't me," she replied, looking genuinely confused. Sam shrugged. "Maybe you just forgot where you put them." I didn't buy it, but I let it go. We packed up and continued on the trail, the fog from the night before lingering in patches. Emily lagged behind, her eyes darting around like she expected something to jump out at her. By midday, Sam's GPS started acting up. The screen flickered and the trail map wouldn't load. When Heather pulled out the printed map, we realized it had smudged so badly in the damp air that most of the landmarks were unreadable. "This is just great," I muttered. Heather laughed. "What's the worst that could happen? We get lost and the whisperer eats us?" "Not funny," Emily snapped, surprising all of us. Heather raised her hands. Okay, sorry." As the day wore on, the forest grew eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots crunching leaves. When we stopped for lunch, Heather found claw marks on a tree trunk. They were deep, running vertically up the bark, far too high for any animal I could think of. "Probably a bear," Sam said, though he didn't sound convinced. Emily shook her head. "Bears don't leave marks like that." That night, things got worse. We set up camp in another clearing, and Heather insisted on filming some paranormal investigation footage. I tried to talk her out of it, but she was determined. As she waved her flashlight around, calling out to the whisperer like some ghost-hunting TV host, Emily sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "We shouldn't be here," she said quietly. Heather ignored her. Later, as we were settling into our tents, Emily suddenly grabbed my arm. "Don't go into the woods," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not planning to," I replied, uneasy at how serious she looked. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside my tent. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows. Across the clearing, Heather's tent was unzipped, but she was nowhere in sight. "Great," I muttered, stepping out. "Heather, where are you?" The tapping stopped. "Over here," a voice called. It sounded like Heather, but something was off. Her voice was flat, mechanical, like a recording. I turned my flashlight toward the woods, but I didn't see her. The voice came again, fainter this time. "Over here, Nate." I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. "Heather, this isn't funny." Behind me, I heard a rustling. I spun around to find Heather stepping out of her tent, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she mumbled. I stared at her, then at the woods. "I thought you were out there." She frowned. "I've been asleep." The next morning, Sam went missing. We woke up to find his tent empty and no sign of him nearby. Heather was frantic. calling his name and running in circles around the campsite. Emily just sat there, pale and shaking. "He's still here," she whispered, "but he's not Sam anymore." "What the hell does that mean?" I snapped. Before she could answer, Sam stumbled out of the woods, looking disoriented. His clothes were dirty, and his face was scratched, like he'd been running through branches. "I saw someone," he said, his voice shaky. "It looked like my brother, but it wasn't him." Heather hugged him, but I noticed he didn't hug her back. That night, the fog rolled in thick, swallowing the clearing. Emily started muttering to herself, her voice low and urgent. I crouched next to her, trying to calm her down, but she suddenly grabbed my hand. "It's here," she said, her eyes wide. And then I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It had no face, just smooth, dark skin that seemed to absorb the light. It tilted its head, and I heard my own voice calling out from the trees. "Over here, Nate." Heather screamed, grabbing her camera, but before she could film it, the entity lunged forward. The camera flew out of her hands as she collapsed, unconscious. "Run!" I yelled, dragging Emily to her feet. We bolted toward the RV, Sam stumbling behind us. The fog seemed to twist and stretch, turning the trail into a maze. I could hear the thing behind us, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. When we finally reached the RV, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life just as the shadow appeared at the edge of the lot. It didn't follow us, but stood there, watching as we sped away. Heather woke up hours later with no memory of what had happened. Emily wouldn't talk about it, and Sam wouldn't meet my eyes. When Heather uploaded the footage, there was nothing on the video, except for a brief moment, just before the screen glitched, where a tall, faceless figure could be seen standing in the fog. I haven't been back to Devil's Path since, and I never will. My name is Cassidy Morgan, but most people call me Cass. I'm 27 years old, and I live full-time in my RV. It's a lifestyle I've grown to love, one that lets me stay away from people and their noise. After my breakup with Leah last year, I decided I didn't need anyone else. Just me, my RV, and the open road. I'm independent, resourceful, and self-sufficient. At least I thought I was, until what happened at Black Bear Creek. This was in late October 2023, just as the leaves were turning gold and red across the Finger Lakes. I'd read about Black Bear Creek in an old hiking forum. People mentioned its solitude, crystal-clear streams, and eerie beauty. It sounded perfect for a few days of practicing my survivalist skills and maybe gathering some content for my travel blog. Sure, there were rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences, but I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. I figured those tales were just a way to keep tourists away from a hidden gem. If I'd listened to the warnings, I might have saved myself from what came next. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my RV at a small clearing near the creek. The air was crisp, the forest quiet except for the soft burble of water in the distance. I set up a small fire pit, brewed some coffee, and leaned back in my folding chair, letting the peace settle over me. But as the sun dipped below the trees, a dense fog rolled in, thick, white, and sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. At first, I didn't think much of it. Fog was normal in late fall, right? But this fog didn't feel normal. It muffled sound in a way I'd never experienced before, turning the forest into an eerie void. Even the crackle of my fire seemed muted, like the fog was swallowing it. I remember Leah's voice in my head, teasing me. "You're always so sure of yourself, Cass. One day, you'll meet something you can't explain." That night, I fell asleep uneasy, with the fog pressing against the RV's windows. The next morning, I hiked into the woods, eager to shake off the unease from the night before. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through dense pines and over rocky terrain. About an hour in, I came across something odd. An old mining helmet, rusted and battered, lying in the middle of the path. Its once bright lamp was cracked, and deep claw marks raked across the metal. Nearby, someone had scratched words into a boulder. "Turn back." I laughed nervously. "Cute," I muttered, snapping a photo. Some joker must have thought they'd scare off hikers. Still, the helmet's claw marks bothered me more than I cared to admit. I stuffed my hands in my pockets and kept walking. The deeper I went, the worse the fog became. It clung to the forest floor like a living thing, curling around tree trunks and pooling in low spots. As I pressed on, I noticed something else. There were no birds, no rustling squirrels, no sound except my own footsteps and the occasional creak of the trees. That's when I saw the figure. It was just ahead, barely visible through the fog, a shadowy form standing perfectly still on the trail. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called, my voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Just stood there. I stepped closer, and the fog seemed to thicken, obscuring the figure entirely. When I reached the spot where it had been, there was no one there. Just empty trail. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting, though I didn't remember spending that much time in the woods. My watch, which had been working fine that morning, now showed 12:37 p.m. The fog hadn't lifted all day, and the air felt colder than it should have. I tried to shake off the unease, busying myself with dinner and a checklist of tasks for the next day. But that night, the strangeness returned with a vengeance. It started with the metallic clangs. At first, I thought it was my imagination. A faint, rhythmic noise that seemed to echo through the woods. But as I sat in my RV, the sound grew louder, sharper. It reminded me of pickaxes striking rock, though it was erratic, like someone was mining in fits and starts. Then came the voices. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. Men's voices murmuring and muttering, sometimes rising in anger or pain. I pressed my ear to the RV door, trying to make sense of the words, but they were jumbled, incomprehensible. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the side of the RV. I jumped, grabbing my flashlight and wrenching open the door. My beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but empty trees. I stepped out, heart hammering, and swept the area with my light. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. But when I turned back to the RV, my stomach dropped. On the window, scratched into the condensation, were the words, "Leave." The next day, I decided to explore the ghost town. If this was some elaborate prank, I wanted to see it through. Maybe I could even use the story for my blog. The trail to the town was barely visible, overgrown with vines and littered with debris. As I walked, the fog thickened again, turning the forest into a gray maze. The first buildings came into view suddenly, their outlines looming through the mist. They were skeletal remains of cabins and shacks, their wood rotting and splintered. Tools lay scattered among the ruins, rusted pickaxes, broken carts, fragments of machinery. It was like the town had been abandoned in a rush, left to decay in silence. I wandered deeper, snapping photos, but the air grew heavier with each step. The fog seemed thicker here, almost solid, and I kept seeing movement in the corners of my vision, figures darting between the buildings, just out of sight. Then I found the mine. The entrance was partially collapsed, a jagged hole in the side of the hill. Symbols were carved into the stone around it, crude spirals and runes I didn't recognize. In front of the entrance was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I picked it up, flipping through its fragile pages. The entries were desperate, scattered accounts from someone who had worked in the mine. They wrote about dangerous conditions, collapses, and a betrayal by the mine's owner, who had sealed the shaft to avoid legal trouble. Dozens of miners had been trapped inside, left to die. The final entry read, "They won't forgive. They won't let us leave." As I stood there, the metallic clangs began again, louder than ever, echoing from deep within the mine. I turned to run, but the fog closed in around me, and the figures appeared. They were miners, or what was left of them. Their forms were gaunt and twisted, their faces skeletal and smeared with dirt. They stared at me with hollow eyes, their bodies flickering like dying flames. "You shouldn't be here," one of them rasped, his voice like gravel. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." The miners moved closer, their forms growing more solid. The fog thickened, and I realized I was being herded back toward the mine. My heart raced as I remembered the historian's warning. They demand retribution. Desperate, I opened my pack and dumped its contents. I grabbed a handful of coins, a packet of food, and a compass, arranging them on the ground in front of the mine. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, let me go." The miners stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on the offering. For a moment, the air was still. Then the fog began to recede and the figures faded into the trees. I didn't waste any time. I ran back to my RV, started the engine, and drove until the forest was far behind me. But even now, weeks later, I can still feel their presence. Sometimes, when I camp alone, I hear the faint clang of pickaxes in the distance and see shadows moving in the fog. I don't know if I'll ever escape Black Bear Creek or the ghosts that haunt it. My name is Samir Patel, but everyone calls me Sam. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last few years traveling the country in my RV, seeking solitude after walking away from a stressful IT career. I've always been a rational guy, practical, skeptical, not the type to believe in ghosts or curses. But what happened to me in October 2023 at Devil's Hollow in the Adirondacks has shaken that confidence in ways I can't explain. This happened after my breakup with Elena, my girlfriend of 5 years. She left me because she said I didn't believe in things. Fate, spirituality, the unknown. Maybe she was right. I planned the trip to clear my head and get away from people. Devil's Hollow, with its remote trails and eerie reputation, seemed like the perfect spot. If I'd known what I was walking into, I never would have gone. The first sign I was in over my head came before I even reached the campsite. I stopped at a gas station about 10 miles out, a rickety place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. While I filled up, the old guy behind the counter, grizzled, wiry, with sharp blue eyes, asked where I was headed. "Devil's Hollow," I said, stuffing a granola bar into my pocket. "Gonna camp there for a few days." The man stiffened. "That so? Don't hear many people say that anymore." I laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, well, I like the quiet. Perfect spot for a solo trip." He gave me a long, hard look before saying, "Some places are meant to stay forgotten, son. Don't go poking around where you don't belong." I waved it off as small-town superstition, but the tension in his voice stuck with me as I drove the winding road to the trailhead. By the time I reached Devil's Hollow, the sun was already low, casting the forest in long shadows. The parking lot was empty. No cars, no people. Exactly what I wanted. My first night was uneventful, though the woods felt unnaturally quiet. I set up my RV at the edge of a small clearing, made dinner, and settled into a good book. But as darkness fell, the silence became oppressive. No wind rustled the trees. No insects buzzed. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I finally turned in, I lay awake for hours, listening for sounds that never came. Just before I drifted off, I thought I heard faint laughter, light, almost playful, coming from the trees. I told myself it was my imagination. The next morning, I set out to explore. The trail leading deeper into Devil's Hollow was overgrown but still passable, winding through dense woods and steep ravines. About an hour in, I came across something that stopped me cold. A circular patch of ground, burned black and surrounded by animal bones arranged in intricate patterns. I crouched to get a better look. The bones were small, likely from birds or squirrels, and the circular burn mark had strange symbols etched into the dirt. Spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like an eye in the center. Probably just some kids messing around, I muttered, snapping a photo for my blog. But a chill crept up my spine as I stepped away, and for the first time, I felt uneasy. As I hiked further, things started to get weird. My GPS, which had been working fine earlier, suddenly froze. The screen stuck on an image of static. Then my watch stopped ticking. I glanced at the sun, trying to gauge the time, but it seemed stuck in the same position as when I'd started. When I finally decided to head back, the trail felt wrong. The landmarks I'd passed earlier, an uprooted tree, a cluster of boulders, weren't where I remembered them. It was like the forest was shifting around me, leading me in circles. I didn't reach my RV until dusk. Exhausted and unnerved, I collapsed into the driver's seat, relieved to be back. But as I turned the key, the engine refused to start. It had worked perfectly fine when I arrived. Now it was dead. "Great," I muttered, slamming the wheel. That's when I saw it. A symbol scratched into the dirt just outside the RV. The same spiral and eye pattern from the burned circle. That night, I heard them again. The laughter. Except now it wasn't faint. It was close, echoing around the clearing like it came from every direction at once. I stayed inside the RV, clutching a flashlight, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the sound carried differently in the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. The laughter gave way to whispers, soft at first, but growing louder. They were saying my name. Samir. Sam. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The voice was familiar, almost too familiar. "Elena," I whispered, my throat dry. No response. Just more whispers, more laughter. I slammed the RV's blinds shut, but the whispers didn't stop. The next morning, I found scratches on my arms and legs. Thin, precise lines, like something had dragged claws over my skin while I slept. My head was pounding, and I felt sluggish, like I hadn't slept at all. Determined to figure out what was going on, I hiked deeper into the woods, following the symbols that now seemed to mark a trail. I wasn't sure why I did it. Curiosity, desperation. Whatever the reason, it felt like the forest was drawing me in, daring me to uncover its secrets. After hours of wandering, I stumbled upon an old stone altar, crumbling and overgrown with moss. The symbols were carved into its surface, along with faded runes I couldn't read. Beside the altar was something even more disturbing. A journal, weathered and stained, lying half-buried in the dirt. I opened it with trembling hands. The entries were scattered and incoherent, written by someone who'd clearly been losing their grip on reality. One phrase appeared over and over. "They demand blood. Only blood will set you free." That night, the witches came. I don't know how else to describe them. Shadows that moved against the firelight, their forms twisted and wrong, like figures seen through warped glass. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their voices were a chorus of whispers and screams. "Leave," they said. "This is not your place." I wanted to scream back that I was trying to leave, but my throat was dry, my voice gone. The shadows moved closer, surrounding the RV, their laughter sharp and cruel. The air inside grew cold, and I saw frost forming on the windows. Desperate, I grabbed the journal and flipped to the blood-scrawled phrase. "They demand blood." My mind raced. Was this the key? The only way out? Grabbing my pocket knife, I sliced my palm and let the blood drip onto the altar. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. The laughter stopped. The whispers faded. And then, silence. When dawn broke, the forest seemed normal again. Birds chirped. The wind rustled the leaves. My RV started on the first try, and I didn't look back as I drove away. But even now, I don't feel free. The scratches on my arms haven't healed, and I swear I still hear faint whispers in the dead of night, calling my name. Maybe some places really are meant to stay forgotten. My name is Claire Mercer, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a nature photographer, one of those people who chases the perfect shot of fall leaves or a rare bird while others are sitting in offices or scrolling on their phones. My work takes me to places most people would never think to visit. Sometimes, that's exactly why I go. But I'll admit, Black Creek State Forest wasn't just a random destination for me. It was a place I had heard about for years, whispered about online, tied to old legends and eerie stories. This happened in October of last year, right as the leaves were turning. I was looking for solitude, a chance to immerse myself in nature, and distance myself from the wreckage of my last relationship. What I found instead still haunts me to this day. I arrived in the forest late in the afternoon, after hours of winding roads that made me question if my GPS was drunk. The place was desolate. No campgrounds, no ranger stations, not even a trailhead marker where I parked the RV. Perfect for someone who wanted to get away from people. The woods were beautiful, though. The kind of beautiful that makes you forget you're alone. Sunlight spilled through the golden canopy, dappling the ground in patches of light. It was exactly the scene I wanted to capture for my portfolio, so I set up camp quickly, eager to get started. By dusk, I'd already noticed something was off. First, my camera batteries were draining faster than I'd ever seen. I'd charged them fully before leaving, yet they seemed to die within minutes of use. The same thing happened to my phone, which made no sense. Frustrated, I told myself the cold was messing with the equipment, even though it wasn't that cold yet. Then there was the sound. It started just after sunset, a faint crying like a child. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder, more distinct as the night went on. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a fox or some bird I didn't recognize. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I locked the RV doors that night, more out of habit than fear. I remember lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the sound of that crying moving through the trees. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach churn. There were footprints outside the RV, dozens of them. Small, barefoot prints that circled the vehicle again and again. I crouched down to get a closer look, trying to convince myself they were animal tracks, but they weren't. They were human. I told myself someone else must be camping nearby, maybe a family with kids. I hadn't seen any other vehicles, but the forest was huge. It was possible. Still, something about those prints didn't sit right with me. They were too uniform, too deliberate. I decided to push my unease aside and focus on my work. That's why I'd come after all. I spent the day hiking, taking what pictures I could with my dwindling battery life. The forest was eerily quiet, even during the day. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush. just the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional creak of a branch. It was on one of these hikes that I found the shrine. It was tucked away in a hollow, barely visible until you were right on top of it. A circle of weathered stones, piled high with decaying children's shoes, faded toys, and other offerings that looked older than I was. In the center was a single flat stone, carved with a symbol I didn't recognize. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it. Something about the place felt wrong. But instead of turning back, I did what I always do. I took pictures. That night, the crying returned, louder this time. I tried to drown it out by turning on music, but my phone died halfway through the first song. The RV's generator sputtered and failed shortly after, leaving me in total darkness. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. Just a single light tap on the RV door. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. I opened it a crack and shone the beam outside. Nothing. Just the trees, silent and still. I shut the door quickly and locked it, feeling foolish. But the unease lingered. I didn't sleep that night. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent, moving from the door to the windows. When I finally dared to look out, I saw it. A child, standing in the clearing, illuminated by the pale moonlight. They couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes. But it wasn't their clothes that made me go cold. It was their eyes. They were pitch black. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. The child didn't move, didn't speak, but somehow I could hear their voice in my head. "Let me in," it whispered. I stumbled back, slamming the blinds shut. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I started driving, the road twisted back on itself, leading me in circles. No matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the clearing. The child was waiting for me, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. I spent the next few hours frantically searching for answers. Using what little battery I had left on my phone, I tried to look up the symbol on the shrine stone. I found it in an old occult forum, a sigil tied to child sacrifice and protective wards. The pieces clicked into place. The shrine was meant to keep something contained, and by disturbing it, I had broken the seal. That night, the child grew bolder. They appeared closer to the RV, their whispers turning into screams. They mimicked voices from my past, my ex, my mother, even my own voice, begging me to come outside. Desperate, I decided to go back to the shrine. I hiked through the dark, the child's cries following me every step of the way. When I reached the hollow, the air was thick with the stench of decay. The shrine seemed to pulse with energy, the stone glowing faintly in the moonlight. The child appeared, standing just a few feet away now. Their face was pale, their black eyes fixed on me. "Join us," they whispered, extending a hand. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. I grabbed a rock and smashed the shrine stone with all the strength I could muster. The child let out a blood-curdling wail as the offering scattered, and the ground beneath us trembled. The air grew impossibly cold, and I thought for a moment I'd made a terrible mistake. But then, everything went still. The child was gone. When I returned to the RV, the road was clear. I drove for hours without stopping, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Even now, safe at home, I feel like the forest hasn't let go of me completely. I developed the photos from that trip last week. Most were normal, just pictures of trees and leaves. But in one of them, taken near the shrine, the child is there. Their black eyes are staring right at the camera. My name is Ethan Riley, and I'm 34 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've been drawn to the eerie and unsettling. Maybe that's why I became a horror writer. But lately, my inspiration has been as barren as the trees in winter. That's how I found myself in the High Peaks wilderness of the Adirondacks last October, looking for solitude and a spark to reignite my creativity. What I found was something far darker, something I can't unsee. This happened over the course of 5 days, deep in the heart of that sprawling, untamed forest. The first day was beautiful, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you feel alive. I parked my old RV at a clearing near a lesser-known trailhead, far from the popular routes. I wanted silence, real silence. The kind you can't find in a coffee shop or even in the quietest room at home. The trail was steeper than I expected, winding through dense forest that swallowed the sunlight by mid-afternoon. I wasn't in great shape, but I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to climb peaks or break records, I just needed space to think. That night, things started to feel off. After setting up camp near a high ridge, I made a small fire, boiled water for some instant soup, and cracked open my notebook. I thought I might finally get a few pages down. Instead, I found myself staring at the blank page, distracted by the oppressive silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was unnatural. No rustling leaves, no distant bird calls. Just the crackle of my fire and the occasional creak of a tree in the wind. Then I heard it. A low, distant howl. It wasn't a wolf. I've done enough camping to know the sound of wolves, coyotes, even foxes. This was different, deeper, more resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I froze, pen hovering over the page waiting for it to stop. When it finally faded, I laughed nervously to myself. Just an animal, I muttered, though my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. The second day was worse. I woke to find my food bag torn open and scattered across the campsite. I'd hoisted it into a tree the night before, following all the usual precautions to keep it away from animals. But the rope had been severed, cleanly, as if cut with a knife. That wasn't the only thing out of place. A circle of animal bones surrounded my campfire. I hadn't noticed them the night before, but there they were. Small, weathered bones arranged in a perfect ring. My stomach churned at the sight. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I convinced myself it was a prank. Maybe some other camper had passed through and decided to mess with me. I tried to laugh it off as I repacked my supplies and hiked deeper into the woods. But as the day went on, the unease grew. The trail I'd been following disappeared into a tangle of undergrowth, forcing me to backtrack and bushwhack my way forward. My ankle twisted on a hidden root, sending me sprawling into the dirt. I cursed loudly, clutching my throbbing foot. When I looked up, I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its arms were too long, its body skeletal, with patches of fur or something worse clinging to its frame. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light like a predator's. I blinked, and it was gone. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, my voice shaking. "You're imagining things." But my hands trembled as I tightened the straps of my pack and limped back to camp. That night, the howl came again, closer this time. My fire sputtered weakly, no matter how much kindling I added. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the stench of rotting meat seeped into my nostrils. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sounds grew clearer, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, clutching the hunting knife I'd brought more for comfort than practicality. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The forest went silent. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I saw a pair of glowing eyes. By the third day, I knew I wasn't alone. The tracks confirmed it. Massive, clawed footprints led from the edge of my camp into the woods. They weren't human, but they weren't quite animal either. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into thin air, as if the creature had taken flight. My ankle throbbed with every step, making it nearly impossible to hike back to the RV. I was trapped, and I knew it. The whispers had returned, stronger now, weaving through the trees like an unholy chant. I recognized my own name in their rasping tones, followed by laughter. And then there was the hunger. I couldn't eat. Every time I tried, I felt like I was being watched, like something out there was waiting for me to weaken. My supplies dwindled as I abandoned half-eaten meals, too nauseated to continue. That night, the figure stepped into the firelight. It was worse up close. The wendigo, it could only be a wendigo, was taller than I'd thought. Its body impossibly thin, with gray decaying flesh stretched tight over its bones. Its antlered skull gleamed in the flickering light, and its eyes burned with an unnatural hunger. I scrambled backward, clutching my knife. The creature tilted its head, watching me with a twisted sort of curiosity. Then it lunged. I slashed wildly, the blade skimming its bony arm. It recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting screech that rattled my skull. The fire flared, momentarily blinding it, and I used the chance to crawl into my tent and grab the flare gun from my emergency kit. When I emerged, the wendigo was circling the fire, its skeletal hands flexing as if preparing for another strike. I aimed the flare gun at its chest and fired. The flare hit its mark, exploding in a burst of red light. The wendigo let out a horrific wail, its body writhing as the fire consumed it. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, making me gag, but I didn't stop to watch. I grabbed my pack and limped into the woods, praying I could find the trail in the dark. By dawn, I reached the RV. My body was battered, my mind frayed, but I didn't care. I started the engine and tore down the dirt road, not stopping until the forest was miles behind me. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? But the encounter changed me. My nights are filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and whispering trees. And sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the howl again, distant but unmistakable. The wendigo isn't dead. I don't think it can die. It's waiting, hungry, patient, and impossibly cruel. And it knows my name. My name is Jamie Carter, and I'm 28 years old. I've always been drawn to strange, dark places and the stories that haunt them. Maybe it's my love of history, or maybe I just like feeling like I'm stepping into someone else's nightmare. Either way, that's what brought me and my best friend Lena to Sleepy Hollow, New York, last October. What I thought would be a harmless, ghost-hunting RV trip ended with us barely escaping with our sanity intact. This happened in the dense woods near the Hudson River, not far from the old Dutch church cemetery. And I swear to you, every word I'm about to tell is true. Lena and I had been planning the trip for months. I'd talked her into it with promises of scenic hiking trails and a visit to the iconic landmarks tied to Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. She wasn't exactly thrilled about the ghost hunting aspect, but I knew she'd come around. That's just how our friendship worked. Me pushing boundaries, her pulling us back from the edge. We arrived late in the afternoon, parking the RV in a quiet clearing a little off the beaten path. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the towering oaks around us. I remember thinking the place was perfect, isolated but not too far from civilization. "Are you sure about this?" Lena asked, leaning against the RV and crossing her arms. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her expression was as skeptical as ever. "Come on," I said, slinging my backpack over one shoulder. "It's just for fun. We'll explore, take some pictures, and maybe freak ourselves out a little. You'll love it." "I'd love it more if we weren't camping in the middle of a ghost story," she muttered, but she followed me anyway. The first weird thing happened as we were setting up camp. I was unrolling my sleeping bag inside the RV when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like hooves striking the ground. "Did you hear that?" I called out to Lena, who was outside arranging firewood. "Hear what?" she replied. "That sound. It sounded like galloping." She paused, her brow furrowing as she listened. The woods were silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "You're imagining things, Jamie," she said. Maybe I was, but something about it unsettled me. We spent the rest of the evening exploring the woods. The trail near our campsite led us to a small clearing dotted with headstones, half hidden by moss and creeping ivy. The names were worn away by time, but I couldn't help feeling like we were trespassing. "Let's go back," Lena said, her voice tense. "Just a few more minutes," I insisted, snapping pictures with my phone. That's when we found the hoof prints. They were deep, perfectly shaped, and they led straight into the woods. I knelt down to get a closer look. "These are fresh," I said. Lena frowned. "There aren't any farms around here, are there?" I shrugged, feeling a thrill of excitement. Maybe they belong to him. The horseman. She rolled her eyes. "Right. And I'm sure he stopped for a latte before heading out to scare some tourists." But as we followed the prints deeper into the forest, the playful banter faded. The tracks suddenly stopped in the middle of the clearing, as if the horse had simply vanished into thin air. "That's weird," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's go back," Lena said again, and this time I didn't argue. That night, the real terror began. The RV felt cozy at first, with the warm glow of our lanterns and the soft hum of the generator. Lena was flipping through a book while I reviewed the photos on my phone. "Jamie," she said suddenly, "it's cold." I looked up. My breath hung in the air, a thin cloud of vapor. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I shivered as I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me. "That's weird," I muttered, checking the thermostat. The heater was on, but it wasn't doing anything. Then came the knock. It was faint at first. A soft tapping on the RV door. I froze, my stomach twisting into a knot. "Did you hear that?" Lena whispered, her face pale. I nodded. "Stay here." Grabbing a flashlight, I crept toward the door and swung it open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, silent and still. I closed the door, locking it this time. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy breathing. For a moment, I thought it was Lena, but when I turned to look, she was sound asleep. The sound was coming from outside. I lay frozen, my heart pounding as the breathing grew louder, more guttural, and then it was gone, replaced by the sound of galloping hooves, so close I could feel the vibrations in the floor. "Jamie!" Lena screamed, sitting bolt upright. The RV shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. I grabbed her hand and we huddled together, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, we didn't dare move for what felt like hours. By morning, we were both on edge. "We need to leave," Lena said as soon as the sun rose. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when we stepped outside, the forest seemed different. The trees loomed closer, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. and our footprints from the previous day were gone, as if the woods had swallowed them. As we packed up to leave, Lena froze. "Jamie," she said, pointing. The RV door was wide open. "I locked it," I said, my throat dry. We checked the interior, but nothing was missing. Nothing except our sense of safety. The final straw came that afternoon. We tried to follow the dirt road back to town, but no matter which direction we drove, we kept ending up back at the clearing. "It doesn't make sense," I shouted, slamming the steering wheel. Lena stared out the window, her face pale. "We're trapped, Jamie. It won't let us leave." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. Desperation drove us to the clearing where the hoof prints had vanished. "If it wants something, we'll give it to it," Lena said, her voice trembling. I thought about the stories I'd read, the ones where offerings were left to appease restless spirits. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We gathered personal items, Lena's bracelet, my journal, and placed them in the center of the clearing. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking, "let us go." The woods grew silent, unnaturally so, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure on horseback, its headless form glowing faintly in the dim light. It stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless, watching us. It began to move, its horse pawing the ground as it charged straight toward us. I grabbed Lena's hand, squeezing it tightly as the specter closed the distance. Just as it reached us, it vanished, leaving only the faint smell of smoke in its wake. When we returned to the RV, the road was clear. We didn't speak as we drove away, the forest growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us, waiting for its next victims. Even now, months later, I can still hear the sound of galloping hooves when I close my eyes. So, if you're ever tempted to visit Sleepy Hollow, remember this: some legends are better left alone. My name is Sophia Kane, and I'm 29 years old. I've spent the past 5 years chasing mysteries as a freelance journalist, digging up stories most people wouldn't touch. Ghost towns, urban legends, you name it, I've probably written about it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last October in the Keterskill Wild Forest, just a few hours from my apartment in New York. This happened while I was investigating a place the locals call Cursed Creek. People in nearby towns warned me not to go, spinning tales of hikers who went missing in strange, glowing water that no one could explain. I thought it was the perfect setting for my next story. I never imagined I'd become part of it. I arrived in the forest just after midday. The drive was uneventful, but as soon as I turned onto the dirt road leading to the trailhead, the RV's lights flickered. The dashboard clock blinked off, then back on. I made a mental note to check the battery later and parked in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The forest was stunning in that eerie, isolated way that makes you forget how dangerous nature can be. Thick moss carpeted the ground, and the faint sound of running water echoed through the trees. I pulled out my backpack and gear, audio recorder, notebook, camera, and set off toward the creek. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Forests are never completely quiet. Even when there's no wind, you hear birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. But here, it was like the world was holding its breath. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the trail. About halfway to the creek, I saw the markings. Symbols carved into the bark of several trees, sharp and angular, like something out of an old spell book. I crouched down, brushing my fingers over one of the carvings. It looked fresh, the edges of the wood still raw. I snapped a few pictures and kept walking. The deeper I went, the harder it was to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the creek, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the water. The creek itself was beautiful, too beautiful. The water shimmered unnaturally, reflecting a greenish glow that seemed to come from below the surface. I pulled out my camera, but when I tried to take a picture, the screen went black. "Seriously?" I muttered, smacking the camera. It refused to turn back on. I grabbed my audio recorder instead, clicking it on as I described the scene. The water has a faint luminescence. Green, almost fluorescent. It doesn't seem natural. The surrounding area is uncomfortably quiet. There's no sign of wildlife. I stopped mid-sentence. Something moved on the edge of my vision. A flicker of shadow among the trees. I set up camp a safe distance from the creek, unpacking my small tent and laying out my sleeping bag. The forest seemed to press closer as night fell, the silence growing heavier. I sat by a small fire, writing notes in my journal, when I heard it. A voice. "Sophia." It was faint, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but unmistakable. My name. I froze, the pen slipping from my fingers. "Hello," I called, my voice wavering. No answer. Just the sound of the creek in the distance. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing. But when I turned back toward the fire, my journal was gone. That night, the dreams started. I was standing at the creek's edge, the water glowing brighter than before. A woman stood on the other side, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She was gaunt, almost skeletal, her long hair hanging in damp strands. "Leave," she whispered, her voice sharp and commanding. I tried to speak, but my throat closed. I woke up gasping, sweat soaking my shirt despite the cold. The fire had gone out, leaving me in total darkness. And then I saw it, the glow. The creek was visible through the trees, its eerie green light pulsing faintly, like it was alive. And standing just beyond the water's edge was the woman from my dream. The next morning, I found the journal. It was lying open on the ground near the creek, though I hadn't been anywhere near the water since setting up camp. The pages were smeared with mud, but one phrase was clear, written over and over again in jagged letters. "It takes what it's owed." I felt a chill run down my spine. Shoving the journal into my pack, I decided to hike farther upstream, hoping to find some explanation for the glowing water, or at least something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I found the altar. It was a crude thing, made of stacked stones and surrounded by more of those strange symbols carved into the ground. Bones, small ones, too small to be animal, were arranged in a circle around the base. A faint smell of decay hung in the air, making my stomach churn. I knelt down to examine the stones. One of them bore an engraving that matched the carvings on the trees. As I traced the lines with my finger, I heard the voice again. "Sophia." This time it was louder, closer. I ran back to camp, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The moment I reached the tent, the storm hit. Thunder rolled through the forest, and rain poured down in sheets, soaking everything. The creek swelled, its glow intensifying as the water rose. And then I saw her. The woman stood just beyond the fire pit, her face pale and twisted with anger. "Why have you come?" she hissed, her voice cutting through the rain like a blade. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me. I just wanted to know the truth," I stammered. Her hollow eyes locked on mine. "You seek the truth, but you bring nothing. You take what is not yours." The ground beneath her feet began to churn, the mud swirling like it was alive. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my pack and knife, and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the altar. The storm raged around me, but the altar stood untouched, the stones dry and gleaming. My chest heaved as I fumbled through my pack, pulling out my journal and audio recorder. "You can have it," I whispered. placing them on the stones. I'm leaving. I won't take anything with me. The air grew still. The rain stopped, and the glow of the creek dimmed. For a moment, I thought it was over, but as I turned to leave, I heard her voice one last time. "You'll be back," she said, her tone laced with both promise and threat. I made it back to the RV by dawn, my clothes soaked and my hands trembling. The engine sputtered as I started it, but it held, and I drove away without looking back. The article I wrote after that trip was my most successful yet, but it came at a cost. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I left a part of myself behind in those woods. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the faint whisper of my name. I won't go back. I can't, but I know she's waiting.